Good afternoon. I'm Tanuja Daney, and I'll be the moderator for our first Compensation Committee webinar of the year. Just last week, the IMF increased its forecast for global growth to 3.9% and U.S. growth to 2.7% for 2018. Salary increases in the U.S. are generally expected to hover around 3%. So what is the outlook for director pay in the coming year? Well, we're about to find out. Today, we are joined by executive compensation experts Jan Kors and Ed Steinhoff of Pearl Meyer. Jan leads the research and production of the annual Pearl Meyer and NACD Director Compensation Report, which is entering its 19th year. Their analysis includes year-over-year changes and helps boards understand current practices and emerging trends in director pay. They'll also share the latest information on board composition, refreshment, and ownership guidelines. Before we take a look at the numbers, Sienna Breen with NACD's education team will take us through a few brief housekeeping announcements. Sienna?
Thank you, Tanuja. Before we begin, I will go over a few housekeeping items, and then I will turn it over to Jan to start the program. First, if you can hear us but cannot see the slides, you may need to enable Adobe Flash Player. You should see an icon in the center of your screen where the slides would normally appear. Click on that icon to enable Adobe Flash Player, and that should bring up the slides. On the right-hand side of your console, you should see several boxes. At the top, you can submit a question to be answered by our speakers during the program, time permitting. Please note that if you do submit a question, you will be opted in to receive future executive compensation thought leadership from Pearl Meyer. In the middle, you can tweet live with us using @NACD and @PearlMeyer. And at the bottom, you can download a copy of today's slide deck and access additional resources. You will automatically receive one NACD skill-specific credit for your participation in this live webinar of at least 30 minutes. Credit may be applied to NACD fellowship programs, and you can contact fellowships@nacdonline.org for more details. Just as a reminder, a recording of this webinar, a copy of the slide deck, and links to the provided additional resources will be available early next week at nacdonline.org/webinars and at pearlmeyer.com. Finally, we will have a few evaluation questions at the very end of the program, and we would really appreciate your feedback, so please stick around after the closing slides to answer those questions. And now I'm going to turn it over to Jan to start.
Great. Thank you so much for that. So, we want to focus on the director compensation results of our review for companies, but to give us a little background and set the stage, let me talk a little bit about who participates in this. We look at the annual proxy filings that disclose director compensation for 1,400 companies. We try year over year to keep those companies fairly consistent so that the changes that we see over years are really based on changes that incumbent companies have made rather than changes in the group itself. Obviously, based on company size and growth, merger and acquisition activity, there's always some change in the companies year to year. Excuse me. But by and large, we try to keep them the same. We take those 1,400 companies and break them into roughly similar sized revenue categories. You'll see on the right-hand side and in the pie chart how those size categories break out. Micro companies, those with less than $500 million in revenues annually. Small, which is $500 to $1 billion in revenues annually. Medium companies, $1 to $2.5 billion. Large companies, $2.5 to $10 billion. And then the S&P, the Fortune 200, if you will, which are those companies that have more than $10 billion in annual revenues. The survey that we do for the NACD, the study we do, also has industry breakouts, but for purposes of this discussion, we focus solely on, and all the data that we show you will be focused solely on these 5 size categories. I know it should be implied by virtue of the fact that I said we take this all from proxy data, public filings, but just so that there's no confusion, this is a study that looks at the compensation for directors for publicly traded companies, not private companies. Again, to give you a little sense of the background of the companies before we dive into the data on the compensation, let's talk a little bit about the demographics of the boards. We've seen over the years a little bit of movement in these numbers, and again, this year when compared to last year's results, tiny movements here and there, but these are largely relatively steady. So the median number of directors ranges, depending on company size, from 8 companies up to 12 companies, or up to 12 directors. That has stayed fairly constant year over year. In terms of the companies that have a one-year term, so companies that have moved to a declassified board where every director stands for re-election every single year. Here again, we've seen small increases over the past several years in this category. There's obviously a fair amount of governance trends towards an impetus towards having declassified boards. And so these numbers too have ticked up versus last year, basically a percentage point. Last year, the all-firm number was 67%. This year, it's ticked up to 68%. As you might expect, you are more likely to see declassified boards the larger the company is within the Fortune 200. It's virtually universal, whereas at the smallest companies, those with $500 million or less, it's just over half. Median director age has stayed flat year over year at 64. Interestingly, the push that we've seen around board refreshment and the focus that we've seen on that issue has started, albeit very slowly, to play out in the director tenure numbers. Those numbers pretty much across all 5 of the size categories dropped a little bit year over year. Not dramatically. When you looked all the way to the right-hand side of the chart at 8.3 as the current median tenure for directors. Last year that number was 8.5, so it's not as if we're making huge sweeping changes on this, but the data, if you are a fan of board refreshment and board turnover, the data would suggest that the numbers are moving in the right direction. And I think kind of tied in with that is the issue of mandatory retirement. So how are companies dealing with that turnover? Historically, there's always been a sense that, we created mandatory turnover as a mandatory retirement as a way to encourage turnover. The mandatory retirement numbers have stayed fairly consistent. They've gone up a tiny bit in aggregate. It was 47% last year, 48% this year, but that's not consistent, again, across the size categories. So I would say that this number has been relatively flat. Median retirement age also relatively flat. The last category we look at is gender diversity on boards. And when you look at gender diversity, again, here the numbers are moving in the right direction, albeit somewhat slowly. In aggregate, you see that all firms have at least 82% of firms have at least one female director. That number is up from 80% last year. The number with at least 2 female directors has gone up from 49% last year to 52%, and the number with at least 3 female directors has gone up from 20% to 22%. Again, what you see here is because the largest companies, the the Fortune 200 companies, the over $2.5 billion companies tend to be the ones that are under the most scrutiny for issues around diversity. And so those tend to be the companies where we see the highest level of number of women on boards. As you get down to, again, the smaller companies, at least everybody, even in the micro group, is now, the majority of companies are at least have one woman on the board, but it's still only 59%.
Jan, sorry to interrupt. It's Tanisha. Sure. We have some questions about whether there's a breakdown for board gender diversity for Latinos and Latinas.
There is not, again, because the way we're collecting this data is based on public filings. It's not a survey, so we're not actually asking companies to self-disclose on that. The reason that we look at diversity only in terms of gender is because that's the thing we can get to. There's not currently, there isn't any mandatory disclosure or consistent disclosure across public companies with regard to other types of disclosure, whether it's any kind of ethnic disclosure or sexual orientation disclosure or any other kind of disclosure. Gender is kind of the one that we can get to simply by pulling the publicly disclosed data. Everything else we'd be guessing.
Great, thank you, Jan.
Sure. The last thing on this chart, and then we've got our first polling question, is the prevalence of combined CEO and chairman of the board roles. Again, another one of those areas around board demographics and governance where outside experts have tended to weigh in and have a position around whether or not it's better to have those two roles split out. By and large, companies have been fairly resistant to this as a mandatory thing. And again, we see these numbers creep up a little bit every year as to the number of companies that make that change. But in fact, despite the fact that you've got governance folks who would prefer to see those two roles split, the data this year actually moved in the other direction. We saw more companies that had a combined role than not a combined role. So clearly, companies are on a different wave on this than the outside governance opinion people are. And with that, I want to move to set up the stage for to dive into the compensation discussion. We thought it would be interesting to poll the audience around how you're thinking about director compensation and the way you review it in light of the fact that ISS, with their 2018 policy, has suggested that they will be taking a much closer look at director compensation this year than they have historically. In fact, they will be potentially thinking about whether or not it should impact their recommendations on particular directors, particularly nom-gov directors, if they find that director compensation is excessive. So our questions for the audience is your company planning to take any actions in light of ISS reviewing the director compensation? And we've got 4 choices for you. No, we feel our director compensation levels are appropriate and defensible. Yes, we will begin to review our director compensation program more frequently and make necessary changes. Not yet. We plan to take a wait-and-see approach, or we haven't even talked about this at all. So, I don't know what your sense is, Ed, in talking to your clients on this topic. I, at this point, haven't heard a whole lot of angst or anxiety from my clients on this topic. I think, knock on wood, most of my clients think that their current director compensation levels are in pretty safe territory, so they aren't going to be on the receiving end of ISS's scrutiny on this one. I suppose we'll see whether or not that they're right about that, but I don't know whether you're seeing something different.
No, I'm not. I agree. Either the boards that I'm working with have not really discussed this too much, or they have, and they're pretty comfortable with how the directors are paid currently and aren't really planning on doing anything more in terms of review than they've completed historically.
Okay, so it'll be interesting. Let's see how the polling looks. So, yeah, I think this would suggest that most of the people on the phone are in the same boat, that we think that people think their director comp is pretty defensible, and so we don't really plan to do things differently than we've done in the past, and we think it's fine. Only 13% or 14% have suggested that they are actually planning to either make changes or step up the frequency of how often they look at director comp. Tanisha, what's your sense of, on the boards that you've been on, how often do your boards review director comp? Is it an annual thing or an every other year thing?
I've seen it as annual review, and with respect to the ISS, guidelines, I do think it's a bit early to tell, but I think, as part of our normal course review, it'll come up as on the annual basis and have a conversation of whether this is commensurate with the workload.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Okay. So with that as background, that everybody feels like their the majority of folks feel like their director comp is already pretty much in market lines and defensible. I will turn it over to Ed to actually run through the data to see if people are right.
All right, thanks, Jan. The next several slides go into a fair amount of detail with regard to the results of our study. Here we're showing for each of the categories of companies that Jan talked about previously, what is the median total direct compensation. That's compensation from all sources, both cash and equity, and both retainers and meeting fees in 2017 versus 2016. So all in, you can see the median is just under 200,000. That is a slight increase from 2016, about a 4% increase. And then we saw with each of the various categories low to mid-single digit increases across all of the different size organizations that are included in the study. You can see going back over the last 7 or 8 years, really have seen a similar pattern of low single-digit increases to director compensation. We do expect that trend to continue going forward. Most organizations are fairly conservative when it comes to director pay, and so we do see modest increases year over year, and I don't expect that to change substantially in the near term. The next slide goes into a little bit more detail on each of the elements of compensation that we've reviewed. So at the top of this table, we're looking at the cash retainer for board service, board meeting fees, and equity awards. And you can see for the cash retainer across all firms, again, a fairly modest 4% increase year over year from our last study in the cash retainer. Board meeting fees are about overall flat across all the different size organizations. The micro and large companies actually saw a decline in the amount of board meeting fees. I think some of that is due to companies shifting from a retainer plus meeting fee approach to an all retainer approach, and so we're seeing some adjustment in the median board meeting fee figures because of that change overall. The largest increase that we see on this table is in the stock awards, and we've seen a 9% increase in the value of equity awards year over year among the companies that we studied, with the largest increase among the micro and medium-sized companies, and then more modest increases among the other organizations. So take all of that, and we see total board compensation, or compensation just for overall board service, increased about 6%. Committee compensation and then total direct compensation have increased about 4%. We looked at total direct compensation per meeting, and that actually went up a little bit more than the overall total direct compensation. And so here we think there might have been an overall kind of median fewer number of meetings this year than in our study last year, and so that drove up the per meeting value to be a little bit higher than the total direct compensation increase. And then the total board cost at the bottom is kind of all in, all elements of compensation for both committee and board service, both cash and equity, increased about 5% overall.
Ed, we have a couple of questions specific to this slide.
Okay.
The first question has to do with, is the stock award more options or restricted stock? And also, can you explain a little bit more about what the cash retainer is?
Okay. Yeah, we have a couple slides on the first question. Most of that value is in restricted stock or stock grants and not in stock options, but we'll talk about the prevalence and values of each of those in a couple of minutes. The cash retainer is an amount that is paid to a director for service on the board. It's a flat amount that is paid every year. Typically, it's paid on a quarterly basis, but it is for service as a board member. Companies may choose to structure their board compensation so that there are only cash retainers for board service, or they may have a blended approach where they're paying both cash retainers and meeting fees, so an additional fee for each meeting that the board member attends. So the cash retainer could be a standalone compensation element, or it could be paid in combination with the board meeting fees.
Thank you, Ed. We also have some questions about, this data here is very specific to the 1,400 companies that were surveyed. Any information or resources for private companies, mutuals, or even family-owned companies?
Sure.
If there's any reports being prepared, or if we can, point some folks to where they might be able to get that information.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And as Jen mentioned earlier, this data is all from publicly traded companies. So we're pulling the data from the proxy statements of all U.S. publicly traded companies. And so there's a lot of data points here, obviously 1,400 data points. And so we have a high degree of confidence in the data. For non-public companies, whether they're mutual companies or generally private companies or family-owned companies, unfortunately there's not as good a source of data available for those types of organizations as we have here with the public companies. And so what I tend to work with a lot of private companies, mutual companies, and family-owned companies. And so what we tend to do is to look at the cash compensation elements of the publicly traded companies, and then we also tend to target below the median for those organizations, reflecting that the the responsibilities and accountabilities for being a director of a private company are a little bit different than for a publicly traded company. So we kind of use this survey data as a primary source and then look just at the cash elements and do some discounting. But I'm actually not aware of surveys as reliable as this one for director compensation among non-publicly traded companies. So that's the approach I tend to take.
Thank you, Ed. And I'm just going to ask one more set of questions before we move on because it is coming up. And that is, are you seeing less meeting fees and more retainers? And can you also explain why stock options are not considered performance-based? Let me know if I should repeat it because it's two questions, actually.
Yeah, we're definitely seeing a trend more toward an all-retainer approach, and we'll get into more detail on this in a couple minutes. So I'll just touch on it briefly. But over the past several years, we have seen companies moving away from paying meeting fees and retainers to just having an all-retainer approach that really gets into paying for overall accountability and responsibility as a member of a board rather than paying for meeting attendance, basically. So it kind of viewing the director role kind of more strategically as kind of punching a time clock, if you will. And so we see that trend. Also, there are a lot of conversations that occur among directors outside of official, quote, meetings. And so sometimes you might get into debates about whether, two chairs of committees talking together about a particular topic, is that a meeting, is that not a meeting? The chair of the board talking with a committee chair, is that a meeting, is that not a meeting? So moving toward more of an all-retainer approach really simplifies administration and, again, is more of a pay-for-responsibility rather than a pay-for-time kind of approach. So definitely seeing move in that direction, and we've got some more detail on that in a couple minutes. With regard to the full value versus or restricted stock or stock grants versus options, I wouldn't say that one is performance-based and one is not performance-based. The reason that more companies pay in stock rather than in options is that organizations view stock awards as more kind of long-term focused, and so with options, obviously once they vest, the directors can exercise and sell, and so you might see more kind of trading of the stock, if you will, than with stock grants, where the view is that they're longer term in nature. They're encouraging director ownership of the stock, just as most companies have executive ownership requirements. And so it's just viewed as more of a longer term incentive or longer term vehicle, and better aligns with shareholders than just pure stock options would.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's move into a little bit more of the detail that we'll get into some of the information that we have on these types of questions. So this slide is showing for each of the size cuts in the study, what is the mix of the various pay elements. So if we take the all compensation that is paid, how much is paid in options, how much is paid in full value stock, how much is committee pay, how much is board meeting fees, how much is board cash retainer. And so you can see across all size organizations, the largest element of pay is that equity grant, full value equity award, ranging from 40% of the total for the micro companies up to 57% of the total for the top 200. This is pretty similar to what we've seen in prior years, but they have increased slightly in terms of the value of the equity, and obviously as the companies get larger, the equity grants get larger as well, and so that percentage increases. But that is across the board the largest percentage of compensation, followed by board cash retainer, which is generally at or slightly below the value of the equity award. And then the smaller elements of pay, you can see the options, a very small percentage. The committee pay is also a relatively small percentage. And then you can see the board meeting fees because of that move I talked about previously of companies going to an all-retainer approach and moving away from meeting fees for that largest group of organizations. It's 1% of the total compensation is board meeting fees. So hopefully that'll give an overall picture of the pay mix for directors among these various sized organizations. NACD has a kind of a best practice that at least 50% of total pay for directors should be in equity. And so here we're looking at the percentage of companies in each of the size categories that adhere to that best practice. And so you can see that across all of the size groups that we looked at, all of the various size companies overall have, at least half of the organizations are paying at least half of the total pay in equity. The percentages have increased year over year. You can see that the trend from 2015 to 2017, and for the first time, we are seeing the micro companies. More than 50% of them are paying at least half of the total compensation in equity. This slide addresses the question earlier about the prevalence of full value equity and stock options. You can see really across all size organizations, the vast majority of organizations are providing full value stock awards versus stock options. In some cases, you'll see a combination of the two where the numbers are adding up to more than 100%, but there's definitely a very strong preference for full value equity versus options for some of the reasons that I talked about previously, alignment with shareholders, more of a longer term view with ownership of the company shares. Interesting to see for the micro companies, we do see a higher prevalence of stock option grants than for some of the other size organizations, and we believe that's really due to companies of that size really trying to mirror with their directors the pay practices that they're using for their executives, where we might see a higher use of options for very small kind of startup type of organizations than for the top 200, for example. But as the slide shows,
Ed, don't you also think that part of it has to do with those smaller companies? Do you consider that there's more potential upside in the stock price, and so the directors want to participate in the leverage that they get by being paid in options versus shares?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that applies to both the executives and the directors. Yes, I think that's definitely a reason that we see more options for those very small organizations. All right. This next slide looks at the prevalence of equity. So most organizations will provide equity grants to their directors, ranging from 88% at the micro companies to 100% at the top 200, and 95% overall are including equity compensation as part of the total director pay mix. We also asked about we looked into the approach the companies take to determining how much equity to grant. And there are kind of two different approaches that the most organizations will take. One is that they will define the amount of the equity based on a fixed value. And so that value will be determined typically based on a market analysis, looking at survey data, peer group data, and determining what is an appropriate value of equity that should be provided to the directors. you can see across the entire survey, 78% of organizations will define the equity in terms of a value. So in other words, we're going to grant $40,000 worth of equity to our directors and then calculate the number of shares based on that value that is intended to be provided. A minority practice is to use a fixed number of shares rather than a fixed value. And so across the entire survey, you can see about 18% will have a fixed share approach, and that would look like this. It would be, we're going to grant 10,000 shares to our directors, and then depending on what the share price is, that will determine what the ultimate value is. That approach is more prevalent, as you can see from the numbers here, among smaller organizations and relatively uncommon for the largest organizations that we reviewed. And then the combination is really kind of a combination of both of those approaches, taking a look at both the value that is provided and the number of shares maybe that have been granted historically and determining kind of how to proceed from there.
So we have, Go ahead, Ed, and then I have some questions from our audience.
I was just going to say, fixed value, I think there's more stability in the size of the awards year over year. There's, if the stock price is increasing significantly or decreasing, you still have a relatively stable amount that is paid to the directors by granting in terms of fixed value. Fixed shares, the value could go up or down fairly dramatically depending on stock price performance, and so a little bit more variability there than with the fixed values.
So Ed, we've got a couple of questions, specifically as it relates to, are you seeing companies distinguishing between inside and outside directors when considering how much to provide in equity pay? And what kind of vesting schedules are you seeing?
In terms of inside versus outside directors, typically, I just want to make sure I understand the terminology. Inside director being an employee of the organization. I don't think the question was about independent versus non-independent directors, but for a director who is an employee of an organization, it actually would be very unusual for them to receive any kind of compensation as a director. So we're really looking here at what is paid to outside directors or non-employed directors of a board. I'm sorry, what was the second part of that?
The other questions were, what kind of vesting schedules are we seeing with equity pay?
Vesting for directors tends to be fairly short. Sometimes the awards will be unrestricted shares, so there is no vesting. In other cases, there might be 1-year vesting or could be longer than that. But typically, it's shorter vesting periods for directors than we might see for executives, where we have longer vesting periods to really focus on retention of the executive talent.
Yeah, I think, I just add on in the vesting thing. I think there are two things that kind of drive that shorter vesting. If you think about it, one is, as more companies, as I said at the beginning when we were talking about demographics, as more and more companies move to a declassified board, if you have a 1-year term of service, then it makes sense to have a vesting schedule on the equity that you are being given for that term of service be kind of coterminous with the term of your directorship. So that's certainly one rationale for the shorter vesting period. And the other thing is, if you think about why we put vesting on equity for executives, it's to get their retention. And as we've all read in articles ad nauseum, getting directors to stick around is not the problem.
Yes, good point. Okay, yep, thank you.
Great, thanks.
All right, just spend a quick second on committee pay. The prevalence of committee pay really hasn't changed year over year, just very, very minor increases and decreases. So these numbers really indicate to us that there really aren't a lot of broad structural changes being made to companies' approaches to committee compensation in the past year. Diving a little bit further into the committee pay, here we're looking at the committee chair pay for each of the three primary committees for a publicly traded company: audit, compensation, and nominating and governance. And so you can see the median pay for the various size organizations for each of the committee chairs. These retainers are generally flat relative to last year, and you can see across the board audit is paid the highest, followed by compensation, followed by nominating and governance. And I think those levels at all size organizations are driven by a couple things. One is the level of expertise that is required to serve on each of the committees, combined with the time commitment that is required both for preparation time for meetings, actual meetings, and time analyzing information in between meetings. So really across the board we see that audit chair being paid the highest, followed by the other two. Similarly, when we look at committee membership, here we can see a similar pattern where members of the audit committee are paid the highest, followed by compensation, followed by nominating and governance. And again, I think that speaks to the factors that I talked about previously with the chairs, the time commitment and the level of expertise that's required to serve on each of those committees. For the top 200, you can see that the median pay for both the compensation committee and the nominating and governance committee members is 0. And that's because the prevalence of committee member pay for those two committees in the top 200 has dropped below 50%. And what's driving that is that for those very large organizations, many of them are moving not just to an all-retainer approach for board service, but to an all-retainer approach that provides for a cash board retainer and an equity board retainer that is also intended to cover committee service. And so committee members for those largest organizations for the compensation and the nominating and governance committee are not receiving any additional compensation beyond their annual board retainers for service on those committees. All right, we'll move to our next polling question now, and this is really based on current events and what's happening in the regulatory environment. So the question is, given the current regulatory environment and recent tax reforms, do you anticipate an increased workload at the committee level? So obviously the answers to choose from are yes, no, or too early to tell. My own experience, and I would say in the last month or 6 weeks or so with my clients has been, there's been maybe a temporary buzz around the regulatory environment, and particularly around tax reform and some of the changes in the tax code as they relate to both the overall business and more specifically to executive compensation. But I don't know that that's necessarily a long-term item for discussion and resulting in a longer-term increase in workload. What have you seen, Jan?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I think there has certainly been a flurry of activity around particularly impact on the taxes, and should we be getting on the give employees $1,000 bonus bandwagon. But I'm not sure that that flurry of activity is something that's going to be sustained. I don't think there's any question that people, that companies are having kind of year-end, end of year, beginning of year discussions about it, but I don't know that it's going to create a sustained increase in the workload.
And I tend to agree. I think, tis the season for fiscal year-end or calendar year-end companies as everyone's preparing for year-end disclosures. I think there's just a lot of activity, but I think I tend to think that, again, to both of your points, that it's probably not sustained. I do think, though, that there's not necessarily an expansion of roles and duties, but perhaps maybe a deepening of engagement and a deepening of some of the work, particularly as it relates to comp and governance when it comes to board work. But again, I would probably answer this question too early to tell.
Well, let's see what everybody else answered.
We see a yes, so almost half of you do think there will be an increased workload at the committee level. 21% no, 31% too early to tell. And I think that's interesting, to your comments a minute ago. I think that there is a deepening. I would certainly agree with that among my clients, there's a lot more time being spent getting into more detailed issues and more detailed discussions than might have occurred in the past. So, we'll kind of see how that plays out, but certainly about half of you are anticipating increased workload in the coming year. And then our next polling question is here, so follow up there. If you do believe there will be increased work at the committee level, which it sounds like you do, does your company have plans to increase committee compensation? So those two seem to go together fairly well. So the possible responses there are yes for at least one committee. No, we don't plan to make changes. Too early to tell. We will wait and see what the actual workload will look like. Or fourth, we do not expect increased workloads. So take a minute and think about that one. I guess I would maybe think about that third option. Maybe it's we are anticipating an increased workload, but I don't see companies kind of diving into making changes immediately. I think they might kind of wait and see how things might play out over the next several months anyway.
Yeah, and I think the other interesting thing there is, is it even if you believe there is an increase in the workload, is it an increase for the whole committee or is it an increase for the chair?
Right, and if it's an increase, is it a sustained increase or is it a kind of a 1 quarter blip, for example? Okay, well, let's see how people responded. Too early to tell, about 41%, and 34% we don't plan on making changes, and then the other responses there, so interesting. All right, Jan, I will turn it back over to you.
Great, thanks. Let's see if we can get the screen to come up. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to switch gears and talk about, Ed talked about the premium on top of regular board service for committee service or committee chair service. This chart shows you information on the premium for the board leadership role, so the non-executive chair role and the leading or presiding director role, and we've broken those two out separately. Here again, relative to market data and prior years, these numbers have stayed fairly constant, both in terms of the number of companies that provide some kind of additional compensation for the role, as well as how those premiums get calculated. Interestingly, when we first started to see the prevalence of lead directors come into the fore, it was all over the map. No longer all over the map. Things have really kind of settled in. If you go all the way to the right hand of this chart, what you'll see is for the non-executive chair position, so this is someone who is the chairman of the board, not an NEO, not in the summary comp table, a non-executive position. On average for the entire 1,400 companies, they get a premium of about 50% over a regular director. It increases, that premium increases a little bit based on the size of the company, goes from about 1.4, a premium of 40% for the smallest size category we've got here, up to a premium of about 75% at the Fortune 200. Leading presiding directors, we see a much more consistent answer pretty much across the board, regardless of company size. Lead directors are getting a premium for playing that role of somewhere in the neighborhood of 11 to 12, 13% over what a regular board member receives, and that's fairly consistent. In my experience, most often, for the lead director, most often that premium is in the form of simply a higher cash retainer. On the non-executive chair side, it is probably most frequently also just a larger cash retainer, although occasionally for the non-executive chair, because we are talking about bigger premiums, you will see that premium split between an additional cash retainer and an additional equity grant. In time, I'm going to move on to our last bit of data, which is on ownership guidelines. And here again, ownership guidelines, the trends over time have been fairly consistent. We're not seeing a lot of movement in the data, little ticks up or down, depending, but things have pretty much seemed to have settled in. The majority of companies have some form of a stock ownership guideline for their non-employee directors. At the micro companies, it's just over 50% that have some form of an ownership guideline, all the way up to the Fortune 200, where the prevalence of ownership guidelines is 86%. So in aggregate for the group of 1,400, it's at about 3/4 of the companies have guidelines. Most often, those guidelines are set as a multiple of the cash retainer. So one of the kind of things to think about is you look at this data and say, maybe we too want to move from meeting fees to rolling our meeting fees into our board retainer, or rolling our committee pay into board retainers. Remember that if you do that and you've got a typical multiple of retainer ownership requirement, in making big jumps in your cash retainer for board service also creates big jumps in your ownership requirements for your directors. Just kind of one of those roll-on consequences that you want to be cognizant of. Most often those ownership guidelines are 5x your cash retainer. The smaller companies, it's a little less, 3x for companies under 500 million, 4x for companies between 500 million and $1 billion. You typically have, as a new director, companies typically give new directors somewhere between 3, 4, 5 years to meet that ownership guideline. Then you're expected to hold on to that minimum number of shares or value of shares for the entirety of your service. There are a number of outside organizations like ISS who would love to see companies have not just an ownership guideline, but also an additional holding requirement that would make companies hold on to stock or make directors hold on to their stock over and above their ownership guidelines until such time as they leave the board. That has not really caught on amongst companies. As you see from the bottom half of this chart, only about 25% of companies out there have some kind of a holding requirement in addition to their ownership guideline. And even when they do, if you look to the second to last line, even when they have put in a holding requirement, it's only a holding requirement that's in force until such time as you meet your ownership guideline. Then you are free to sell shares over and above that. So this is, and again, year over year, none of the numbers on this page have really moved much. You know, a percentage point here, a percentage point there, but these numbers have stayed fairly constant. So with that, I want to move to our last polling question. And Tanuja and I can have an interesting discussion. We had an interesting discussion about this as we were prepping for this session. Who owns director compensation within your organization? Do you put it in the compensation committee, or do you put it in the nominating and governance committee? Myself, in terms of just what we see in the market, it runs about 50-50. There doesn't seem to be an overwhelming prevalence of one versus the other. And Tanuja, I'll let you weigh in on this, but you know, I have always kind of looked at it as, you know, it's a workflow issue. It's who's in, you know, you're dealing with a compensation consultant anyway. You might as well have them do the director comp too. But Tanuja, you had a really interesting alternative take on it.
Yeah, so over the years, you know, I saw it quite a bit in the compensation committee, owned by comp committee, just for the reasons you described. But then, you know, over the years, I've seen this particular agenda item moving into the governance committee, primarily because, you know, all things board related fall within the NomGov committee, and there seems to be kind of a larger emphasis, a greater emphasis on board performance, retirement ages, term limits, and all those confluence factors, board evaluations that tend to inform and feed into director comp. So I'm seeing it more on the NomGov side, although I'm not doing studies like Pearl Meyer is, but that's just my own anecdotal experience.
I'm going to move to, there was a quick question to answer. So here for the people on the phone, it runs about 70-30, but I think it's a really interesting thing to ponder as a board member. Do you think about director compensation more as a compensation issue, or do you think about it more as a governance issue? And maybe it's the answer to that question that should drive your decision as to who owns it. Excuse me. So food for thought as you all head off to the rest of your days. Let me just kind of wrap up, and then we'll quickly go through our housekeeping issues. Where's my slide? Oh, wrong one. So just in terms of takeaways, we would say the same modest increases that we've seen, those kind of mid-single-digit increases. Despite all of the flurry of activity that we see around board meetings, we don't expect that anything is going to change that for the foreseeable future. So we would expect to see that mid-single-digit trend continue. We continue to also see a trend of boards streamlining their director compensation, so eliminating meeting fees, eliminating committee fees in favor of a very simplified board cash retainer, board equity grant, and committee and leadership premiums on top of that. Again, we're seeing companies, increasing number of companies move towards an alignment with shareholders. So again, you saw the numbers. An increasing number of companies are now making more than 50% of their equity, of their director compensation in the form of equity, and an increasing number of companies have put in guidelines that require directors to hold on to that equity. So that's consistent. And we'll see where the scrutiny from ISS comes and whether or not that ends up moderating those equity grants or maybe even creating even more homogeneity around director comp than what already exists.